you hear me? It's good? All right, great. I'm glad to be back, and I'm surprised. I thought there would be an empty room today because there was no dog in the abstract, and not many dogs in the talk, I guess, relative to what we're going to talk about in regards to humans. Oh, one fan of humans. Okay, good. But since it's my final talk, I would be remiss not to say thank you again to the Sage Center for hosting me, the fellows. It was really fun to get to know y'all, and Mike for inviting me, and John for doing such a great job, and Jane for helping me get organized, and met lots of friends, got to know some better, and it's really been a real treat. Probably one of the most fun things I've done as a professor is to really hang out with the community of scholars in the way that I got to do. So I'm very thankful, and it was really a lot of fun. All right, so that was me buttering you up. Since you're here for the third time to suffer through what I hope will be a wonderful conclusion to a series of 3 talks. Okay, so just to remind you, the first talk, we tried to identify things that might be unique about human cognition. I settled on these, or I argued for these as being 3 main things that our research has revealed. I highlighted some of the main hypotheses that have been pointed out to explain human evolution, at least as adaptive explanations. Social hypotheses in particular are things that I was very excited about trying to use and generate tests to explain not just human but animal cognitive evolution. And sort of to my surprise, I told you that this hypothesis sprung forth out of the attempt to try to understand animal and human cognitive evolution, which was the self-domestication hypothesis. I argued, or I presented to you the idea that increases in friendliness actually led to fitness in dog evolution, that it created a number of byproducts, phenotypic byproducts, one of which was cooperative communicative ability. One of the things that we were trying to explain that may be a derived feature in our species evolution, and that all of those strange byproducts that were created are linked together by developmental processes. I argued that there are many species that may be candidates of self-domestication. I think we've got great evidence in my mind that bonobos experienced self-domestication, and that explains their divergence from chimpanzees. And I promised you that today I was going to now apply this hypothesis to think about human evolution. So I'm going to do what I've done before, which is I'm going to start where we're going to end. And this is sort of the end of the talk to tell you where I hope we get. And what I'm going to argue today is that we inherited large brains from a common ancestor 1 to 0.5 million years ago. We also inherited the ability to make complex tools like Acheulean hand axes. We inherited the ability to do things like cook and other complex technological skills from our last common ancestor. And we share those, actually, I'm going to argue, with many of the other human species that were alive as we were evolving. The question then becomes, how come we are the last human still around? What happened to the other humans that we were sharing the planet with? Why did they go extinct and we flourish? And I'm going to suggest today that it was selection for prosociality towards intragroup strangers that actually was the key shift in our species evolution that altered our psychology and gave us an advantage over other humans. As predicted by the self-domestication hypothesis, in animals, the prediction is there'll be a number of byproducts that we observe in humans that were not directly selected for but are created because when you select for friendliness, you have to alter developmental pathways, and we can look for evidence of some of these byproducts in humans. All right, and I'll explain to you as we go why I think this is a huge advantage for our species over others. My main network of brain power, it's particularly relevant today as we're talking about human evolution and the hypothesis we're going to put forth, because the idea is that everything that I'm going to share with you is because of lots of other people's great work and learning from others, lots of other people's innovations that I then built upon. And if I was just a scientist on an island, boy, I would have nothing to share with you today. Very little anyway. All right. If you're interested in more, Richard Wrangham, who really has helped lead in thinking about human self-domestication. He has also led in getting his book out first, which is fantastic and deserved, because really I would never have thought about human self-domestication if it hadn't come off of his lips first. And so he has a book called The Goodness Paradox that is already out. It came out earlier this year. What I'm going to argue today overlaps a lot with what he argues, but actually it's in many ways we do not overlap. I don't know that we disagree, but we sort of come at things from different angles. All right, our book, Vanessa and I are writing another book really on human self-domestication called Survival the Friendliest, and it'll be out this time next year. Okay. In the meantime, if you're interested in reading the argument, and it might be better to read than to listen, I don't know, I'll try my best today. I did publish a paper in Annual Review of Psychology called Survival the Friendliest that makes the argument, has all the citations, et cetera, that I'll use today. All right, so this is a crazy idea, and I'm going to fully admit, because when Richard Wrangham first said to me as we were working with animals, gosh, you know, I think thinking about self-domestication could be really a powerful way to think about human evolution. I remember thinking, my God, what? No, we're just trying to explain bonobos. Now we're going to go explain humans? Whoa, time out. I was already worried about the bonobo part. And he said, no, this is great. You know, I'm so excited. And so I was nervous for a number of reasons, and I started to seriously think about it with him. And this was in 1999 and 2000. And it was not until 2012 we wrote our paper on bonobo self-domestication, and it wasn't until 2017 that I just published a paper on human self-domestication. So we were very worried for a very long time that this was a crazy, nutty idea. And there were some big barriers, and there are probably more that we haven't thought of that maybe you guys will point out to us, but these were the ones that we had in front of us. 1 is the challenge, 2 is the link, and 3 is the moment. And I'll explain to you what I mean by these. The first is the Tomasella challenge. The idea is that you have selection on emotional reactivity in all these different animal species that led to self-domestication. So the idea is you're attracted to the thing you used to be fearful of, and it's really a story about HPA axis, neuropeptides, hormones shifting, and to change how those systems develop, you have to alter early fetal development. And then it has this cascading effect. All right, so Mike Tomasella is saying, that's all wonderful, but if you want to apply this to humans, you have to explain why bonobos aren't humans if bonobos are self-domesticated. It can't just be all emotional reactivity if you're going to explain how humans have been shaped as our lineage evolved to do the things we do that are cultural, linguistic, et cetera. All right. The next problem was there even a link between temperamental variability and theory of mind skills in humans? And when we first started thinking about this, there was absolutely no evidence in the literature that this was the case. And in fact, Jerry Kagan, who was a very good mentor for me in graduate school, was adamant that temperament was a totally separate construct from any cognitive ability. And that he was actually kind of upset that we were suggesting that maybe these things were pushing each other around. Henry Wellman at Michigan University got excited about our Fox work, and he totally independently, the papers came out before I even knew he was doing it, tested the idea that there was a link between the development of theory of mind skills in young children and variability or individual differences in temperamental profiles in children. And the short and dirty of what he found is that shy, observant, non-aggressive children develop theory of mind skills earlier than those that are less shy and show aggressive behaviors on a variety of different scales. And the second finding, oops, got a little excited there. This is perfect for emotional reactivity. The second set of findings that's relevant here is that there has been some work linking activity in the social network, or even maybe the theory of mind network, if you'll allow me, and emotional reactivity. The idea being that when people are socially threatened or they feel disgusted by others, you see a reduction in mentalizing and activity in mentalizing regions of adult human brains. And this reduction in activation is related to in particular, TPJ and precuneus activity, which, first of all, especially temporal-parietal junction, has been argued to be, especially by Rebecca Sachs, to be critical to theory of mind, reasoning, perspective taking, et cetera. And precuneus is actually, might be a really undersold character in the social network. And in the work that I'm going to cover today, you'll see that it keeps coming up again and again. So for the cognitive neuroscientists in the room, I would love to hear what you think about some of the ideas, because I certainly had never heard about precuneus being particularly important or involved in any of the social work I was paying attention to until I started working on this problem of human self-domestication. Okay. So there may be a link between temperamental, emotional activity, individual differences, theory of mind abilities, but the next problem was the moment. And in trying to think about the moment, it actually helps answer Mike Tomasello's challenge. So it was Steve Churchill, when I got to Duke, who got really excited about self-domestication because he is very interested in late human evolution, studies Neanderthals and the evolution of throwing. He's been very involved in the work on Sediba and Ardipithecus, et cetera. So he's a paleoanthropologist by training and a functional morphologist. But he is very interested and uses hunter-gatherers and thinking about hunter-gatherer sociality to sort of model Neanderthal life history and behavioral ecology. And in talking to him about self-domestication of bonobos and animals, well, he then pointed out the moment. Because the question is, when would humans have experienced any kind of self-domestication, if this hypothesis has any legs? And there were a number of moments we could have potentially focused on. But his argument was, and really one of the exciting new things, I mean, people think of anthropology probably as sort of a lumbering, slow field, but I mean, in the last 5-10 years, we've learned, and this is a paper just from a couple of years ago, arguing, along with many others, that we were not alone on this planet until, and especially in the last 50,000 years, we were not really alone, and we're not sure we were alone until 50,000 years ago. My point is that there were at least 5 to 7 other humans 50,000 years ago that we were walking around on the planet with, that we were potentially even, in some cases, actively competing with. So Steve's thought was, maybe thinking about human self-domestication explains why we're here and why they're not. All right, so I have to take one little tangent and think again about a similarity that helps point to a difference, potentially between these human ancestors. So there's something that makes us potentially similar that then points to a difference we've already talked about, and I think elevates it potentially in importance. All right, and for the dog fans, I have one dog slide. This is it. So we have been able to look at thousands of dogs on 10 different cognitive measures, and we've been able to look at how their performance on these different tasks is related to a variety of factors, but one of the things we looked at is estimates of breed averages for brain size. So we looked at 74 different breeds. We have data. This is behavioral data on 7,344 dogs that played the same 10 cognitive tests. And then we looked at brain size. And what we found is that on 2 of the 5 different domains of intelligence we have data for, brain size is pretty strongly related. And we've made the argument that both of these measures are measures of executive function. So self-control and working memory. All right. So this is just to set up that within a species, individual variability in brain size is related to executive function. So we also have done a large-scale study, and it's very exciting, and I couldn't help but put all the authors up here because in our field it's really a strange thing, our field being animal cognition. We had 56 authors on an animal cognition paper, which is like totally unheard of. I don't really know why we haven't worked together before like this, but anyway, we managed to do it. I led an effort with Charlie Nunn to get a whole bunch of people to collect data as a team. And we got data on 36 species, over 500 individuals, on 2 different measures of self-control. And then we used phylogenetic corrections, and we tested a bunch of the adaptive explanations we're all potentially interested in. And we were really annoyed, actually, at this result. I was particularly annoyed at this result. When the lead author, Evan McLean, at the time, my postdoc, came in and said, my gosh, it's all absolute brain size. And I told him, I was like, go back and find me anything else. Because we had 3 workshops with all these authors who said, we would love people to stop just using brain size to equate to cognition, because we think there's different types of cognition. They vary independently. And oh my gosh, now we, in our giant large-scale effort, have just supported the thing that everybody's been arguing for forever. So I was a little disappointed, to tell you the truth, and that's how you might know this might be pretty solid, because I hated this finding. This is just looking at the primates. You get the same thing. And sorry, this is absolute, this is relative, and this is absolute and relative again. And so relative does some work, but absolute's a better measure. And then this is one of the adaptive hypotheses we looked at. This is 2 measures of social complexity, group size, and population size across the different 36 species we looked at. And you can see there's no relationship between composite score is performance on the 2 measures. So the higher you are here, the better you do. So that means the guys up top are doing really well, the guys down bottom are doing really poorly, and this is a smaller, bigger brain. Okay, and here this would be you have a bigger or more complex group, less complex, and you're doing better up top. Okay, so let me just show you for fun. I think I'll have time to show you what it looks like. So this is one of the 2 tasks. And we just put food inside this transparent cylinder. All of these individuals are going to look brilliant because we have the ones doing it correct first. So what happens is in an introduction, the tube or the cylinder is actually opaque, and you learn that there's food inside. And then you remove the opaque covering and make it transparent. And so what happens is that these individuals on their first 1 or 2 trials are doing it correctly. We would measure 10 times and look at basically how many mistakes do individuals make. Every species, we had at least 10 individuals contribute data. And so what you could do is you get a mean of basically how many mistakes. And yes, maybe a kid or somebody might make a mistake on the first trial. Maybe you would make a mistake on the first trial. But would you do it 10 times? No, you would very quickly learn to make a detour and reach around and get the food out of the tube. So I think we're almost through with animals looking smart. Maybe, no, this is the problem when you have so many species. They all have to, get there. Okay, here we go. Here's some animals looking not so brilliant. These are squirrels from California, actually. This is Lucy Jacobs' work. Berkeley squirrels, Berkeley. I'm sure here they would be better. Okay, so an incorrect response is if you touch the tube. You should immediately go around and detour and not touch the tube. And the idea is, again, this is like trial 5, 6, 7. They've already done this correctly with an opaque. Now they're having a hard time realizing that they need to take the detour, even though they have successfully gotten the food by taking detours in the opaque and in previous trials when it was transparent. And so a lot of these animals, after 5, 6, 7, 8 trials, they're still making mistakes, reaching directly for the food. They can't self-control this prepotent response. I love this guy. He's very deliberate. Oh, all right. Very smooth cortices here, very smooth. All right. Oh, I can just reach in there and get it. I can taste it, right? Okay. All right, so you get the idea. It goes on and on and on. What does this have to do with humans? Well, here's the exciting thing, is there's a nice relationship between this measure of executive function and absolute brain size. It took me a while and some scientific therapy for me to be able to say that. But it is useful and exciting because, of course, what is the huge signal in human evolution? It's increases in absolute brain size. But back to the similarities, what often isn't emphasized is that over the last 500,000 years, actually there were a number of human species that were within the modern range of absolute brain size. So not just one other species, but probably 3 to 4 other species of humans that had brain size within the range of the people in this room, would suggest that other species of humans had very similar executive control or self-control as we do. All right. Mechanistically, I think Susanna Herculano-Huzel has the best idea for why absolute brain size might be doing what it's doing, because it's tightly correlated to her measure of cortical neuronal density. And I wish I could tell you, she could tell the story better than I can, but basically neuron number scales allometrically with brain size, but primates have actually jumped the train, and we also have a scaling function, but our neuron density gets greater as our brains get larger, whereas most mammals, that's not the case, or at least not as rapidly as we do. So basically, humans do not violate the scaling rule that has been discovered by the work of Herculano-Huzel. We are just primates with giant cortices, which means we have extremely densely packed neurons in our cortex, and that likely could help us explain things like unusual amounts of self-control, executive function, but it also means that these guys almost certainly had very densely packed neurons, just like we do in their cortex. All right. So I'm going to suggest that, and in the case of Neanderthals, there's some individuals that have larger absolute brain size than humans' average modern brain size today. So I think these species here either had equal to, or maybe in some exceptional cases even more self-control than modern humans. All right, so that leads us to here, the idea of self-domestication. If there really is a link between temperament and theory of mind, and we can think about the moment that self-domestication may have shaped human evolution, we might have something to this hypothesis. So what I'm going to suggest is that there were many species of humans that had large brains in the Middle Stone Age. They all probably were capable of cultural ratcheting based on the archaeological or paleoarchaeological record. And there are arguments that they were living at pretty low population density at this point. And of course, the Acheulean hand axe, which I couldn't make and probably none of us could make in this room, is the height of technological advancement 500,000 years ago, when humans, all these different species of humans reach modern human brain size. But then the technological advances, at least according to paleoanthropologists, really sort of plateau, and there's not really a major breakthrough technologically in at least the fossil record we have, until you get to modern behavior that begins to show up 50, maybe 80,000 years ago, if you're generous. So how did we beat out these other humans that were hanging around till modern behavior shows up, and we end up with one human species in agricultural society? The idea is self-domestication. And I don't think it's things like self-control and itself on its own, or having a bigger brain, for instance, that's going to explain how we outcompeted these other species. I think instead it is going to be a different type of selection pressure, and I think referring back to the difference we found in bonobos and chimps, the idea that they are responding emotionally in a very different way to strangers, one in a very positive way, one in a very negative way, but based on familiarity or unfamiliarity. And the idea that humans have a totally different mechanism. We have a totally different new social category that our species responds to, and that is the intragroup stranger. The idea that many people in this room, now I've seen you maybe 3 times or whatever, but when, talk one, I hadn't seen any of you. And we as species can become fast friends as long as we know that there's something about a new individual that means you're part of my group. You guys are you're academics or intellectually minded, or students who are excited about learning new things, and that puts you in my group. So I can immediately be incredibly friendly towards you, and we can bond and do all sorts of things together. All right, I don't think there's any other species on the planet that has this ability to recognize a group member they've never met before based on some arbitrary trait, whether it's a symbolic thing or language or what you're wearing or what you're interested in behaving together to do. All right, so if that's the case, then the evolution of intergroup strangers, potentially what it does for you functionally is it can network together larger networks of innovators. So at some point, and I would suggest in the other species of humans, hypothetically, the prediction would be that if each of these faces represents different social groups, the idea is that they might have bonds with neighboring groups or distant groups through kinship networks in some way, but in general, they're not going to be able to interact in a different way than bonobos and chimpanzees based on familiarity. And they're certainly not going to be able to recognize individuals that might be neighboring groups as potential group mates. In the case of humans, when you have the evolution of intergroup strangers, now your neighbor potentially becomes your group mate. And by group mate, what I'm going to suggest, try to be very specific here, is I'm defining group mate here as not necessarily living or cohabitating together, but you're tolerant enough that you can share things, ideas, and space in time without being extraordinarily violent or fearful of one another. All right. So as a result, then you have sapiens pulse out of Africa with amazing technology. Because you've networked all these innovators together, the ratcheting effect, the idea that you can build innovation on top of previous innovations, but with more innovators networked together, there's more great ideas, and the ratchet goes super fast. All right. So if we're right, we have to somehow show that humans who are capable of doing this, and their selection against this type of activity. I'm a huge Atlanta Braves fan, so I love this as my picture of within group violence. This is Papelbon and Bryce Harper last year got in a big fight in the dugout. Started punching each other. Anyway, there's a reason Bryce is on the Phillies this year. So this is Cameron Crazies. They're from all over the world. Nobody knows anybody. They go into Cameron and they become Blue Devils, and they're like a family. They're bonded, and you see them on TV doing crazy stuff together. So having this shared identity, and you'd imagine there would be selection against these types of actions within your own group. All right, and as a result, there would be the same type of byproducts we've seen in all the other non-human species we've talked about. Now the good thing is, this is trouble over here. How the heck are you going to test that? I always joke in my class, if you ever see a baby Neanderthal, call me immediately and begin trying to catch it. and an erectus even more. So it's going to be hard. Many of these things, many of the things we're interested in, obviously, it's going to be difficult. We have to make inferences since they don't fossilize. But the neat thing is, because there are these byproducts, domestication in many cases does potentially fossilize. So we can look for evidence of selection for friendliness and against aggression. All right, so here's the idea. Humans are fantastic at cultural ratcheting. It's due to larger networks of innovators being connected together. Increasing population density goes along with it, or maybe drives it. But the key point for this hypothesis is that tolerance is required to enhance cooperative communication, allowing for all the things in number one. And for number two, selection for intergroup prosociality is where I put my money, because I think it's something that's really different about our species compared to at least the living apes that we have to compare ourselves to. And then you'll have variants in developmental pathways that we saw in the other animals that are targeted, and that's where selection acts on individual variability there. Okay. So some novel predictions that I want to run through with you. One, well, actually, it'll take me too long to go through them, so I'm going to go through them in detail. So let me just say, these are the things we're going to go through together, and the idea is that they'll help evaluate these parts of the model. All right. So first is, what about friendlier faces? Is there any evidence for selection against aggression driving facial morphology the way that it does in bonobos, the foxes, and dogs versus wolves? Well, this was Steve Churchill's brainchild, and it was really what led us to work together and him to propose the moment that self-domestication may occur, because he got really excited that we could look at the faces, a couple of measures, basically the width, the length, and the size of the brow ridges of humans, members of our own species, Homo sapiens, either before or after 80,000 years ago, where we think by then you've got self-domestication must have occurred if it's going to drive the changes you see in behavior. Okay, believe it or not, nobody really done this before, so we did, and what we found was that as you get closer to today, you have feminization in the human face within our species, members of our own species. So the idea is that as you're traveling through time, you have, these are late Stone Age humans, these are recent human foragers. They all have feminized brow ridges, and they all have narrower and shorter faces. So this is exactly what you, analogous to changes you see in other animals that have experienced selection against aggression. We know that facial features like this that are shaped, it's going to either be secondary sexual characteristics that are shaped by pubertal spikes, say, in testosterone, or maybe changes in where receptor density is in different tissues, et cetera. Or it may just be something earlier in development that's shaping facial shape as well. Okay. So what about friendliness in the hands? I don't know if anybody's had this fun thing. It's the best party trick. If you're a scientist, is you have people look at their 2D/4D ratio. So it's the ratio of your index finger, which is your second digit, to your ring finger, which is your fourth digit. And it ends up that in rodents and in humans, it has been validated to be related to prenatal androgens. Well, when I say it, I mean the ratio of the length between the ring finger and the index finger. So the longer your ring finger is relative to your index finger, the higher prenatal androgens you were exposed to. So when and when I say it's validated in humans, how that was done was amniocentesis was used as a way to measure in utero exposure to androgens, and then children were, when they were born, they were followed as they developed. Okay, so we actually measured this in bonobos and chimps, and we found that bonobos have, chimpanzees actually have a signal of high androgen exposure in utero. Bonobos have a signal of low androgen exposure in utero. Following our work, there was work to look at the few, there's actually, I believe it's 7 Neanderthals that there's enough remains to estimate 2D/4D from, and then looking at human hands as well, doing the comparison, and it ends up that Neanderthals, this is work by Emma Nelson, Neanderthals fit more along the chimpanzee pattern, and humans look more like the bonobo pattern. The idea being that in utero, humans are, relative to Neanderthals, exposed to lower levels of prenatal androgens. Okay, what about melanin, loss of melanin? Wait a second, you know, the whole fox story, it's so cute. They get floppy ears and curly tails and all that stuff, and they get funny colors. Like, it ain't happening in humans. I mean, I guess, and we know Neanderthals had red hair, I guess. I've heard that. So how in the world can we explain, or if we're looking for a decrease in melanin, where would we look? Well, look no further than your eyes. So humans are the only primate without melanin camouflaging our white sclera tissue, or naturally white sclera tissue. Most primates pay, or all other primates pay metabolic costs to create melanin to hide their sclera. Sclera tissue actually originates in the neural crest, in neural crest stem cells, apparently. Mike Tomasello and I, long ago, before we were even thinking about this hypothesis, had already shown that human infants prioritize eye gaze to head movement, whereas apes prioritize head movement to eye gaze. So as young as 12 months, 24 months, young children are really focused on eyes, not on head movement. That was followed up by the work of Tobias Grossman, who's now at UVA, showing that 7-month-old infants discriminate gaze based on these weird vignettes or whatever, and they discriminate gaze direction and emotion based on white sclera size and direction. Even more interesting, he did ERP work that reveals that the infants actually make this discrimination when these pictures are shown at a rate below conscious perceptual thresholds. So it seems that whatever's going on, it's pretty well automated. All right, I have to put this in here. Did I really need to put it? No, but it's just too crazy and cool. So there's some really nice work showing that infants and adults who are led into a store with all these beautiful stuffed animals, people choose stuffed animals that have white sclera, not the ones that have the freaky little eyes here, little beady eyes. There's a big preference, and there's a fun story about the success of Disney, where Steamboat Willie actually wasn't that critically acclaimed, but by the time The Sorcerer's Apprentice came out, the artist had realized to put white sclera on the mouse, and Disney went as a result. Now, I'm just telling that as a fun story. You heard last time where dogs that make more eye contact with their human owners report more satisfaction in their relationship. I also told you that dogs have evolved unique muscles that do not exist in wolves that reveal more sclera as you make eye contact with them. And we also know that there's this interspecific oxytocin loop where making eye contact actually releases oxytocin in you and in the dog. There has yet to be any work to show that that then synchronizes behavior or leads to any kind of additional cooperation and communication, but you could see that that would be a fun prediction to test. And my own work, working with Terry Burnham, we did a Public's Good game where we had a super stimuli of white sclera, and we had people play the Public's Good game, and our prediction was if this was really automatic and if it was really sort of designed as a cheater detection device to allow for better cooperation and communication, you would predict that people would actually pay taxes in the public goods game at a higher rate than they might otherwise, and we did find that that is the case. Now, interestingly enough, there's debate in the literature, and I have lost track with how many replications of this there has been done. Our paper came out almost simultaneously with Dan Fessler's paper, but interestingly enough, we chose white sclera on purpose. And if you see many of the replications, they went with Steamboat Willie. They have eyes spots that look like this. And so I don't know. I think it would be a really interesting analysis. I haven't done it. I don't know. Maybe somebody's already done it. But I think it would be really fun to look at, is it really sclera that matters? I would predict that it does. All right. In producing this higher rate of what I would argue is cooperation due to the presence of sclera. And just to be clear, there was a control condition where this guy's not there. And of course, the subjects didn't know. It was between subject design. They didn't know that this was relevant to their decision at all. OK. All right, so the last prediction, and for me the most important that is totally untested, and this is another one of those catch the Neanderthal or Homo erectus, if you can, stories. If you go to any museum, this is at the Smithsonian in DC, this is a remake of or a makeup of a Homo erectus, you always see our fellow humans done up with white sclera. Based on what? Nothing. So what I'm going to suggest to you is that, and I'm going to introduce to you for the first time, these ancestors. And they're going to look a lot less appealing. You might talk to that guy, or try to. But my question is, when I put chimp eyes on this guy, wait till it settles. Best friends, right? Don't you want to go get a beer with that guy? So what I'm suggesting is, till 50,000 years ago, when you meet your fellow humans, that's who you're meeting. Ooh. Sorry, this guy. This guy's okay. All right. So I'm suggesting that the loss of melanin was a byproduct of selection against aggression, and that it facilitated cooperative communication between humans. There's even some crazy work, and I say crazy because it's crazy cool, and I can't understand. I haven't had time to wrap my head around it yet, but people are arguing that there's even brain synchronization where two individuals interacting in a close dyadic interaction, their brain activation actually synchronizes as they make eye contact, and the more eye contact they make, the more it synchronizes, and it may be related to a within-species oxytocin loop, facilitating more cooperative communication. Okay. What about comparative genomics? We're at the very, very beginning. But there are people interested in this, believe it or not. This is a brand new hypothesis, this self-domestication idea, in terms of in the literature. Richard and I and others have been knocking it around, and actually the idea of humans being domesticated is a very old idea. But the proposals are really, the published proposals are, a year to 4 years old. These are new ideas. Actually, a year to 3 years old, right? So there have been attempts to look for genes that may be signals of domestication, and there have been genes found that are common and seem to be under positive selection in modern humans, but not archaics, and have been under positive selection in domesticated animals, but not their wild progenitor species. Where that goes, I don't know, but it's pretty exciting that that even exists. I think even more crazy, and it's not published, and I don't understand it. I'm just going to say that straight up. But I read it and worked hard to make these 3 little bullets for you, and go through the unpublished paper. But Cedric Box in Spain has a new paper he's submitted for publication where he's arguing, based on Williams syndrome, he has inferred regulatory networks that may be involved in neurocristopathology, which basically means changing how neural crest stem cells migrate, the rate at which they migrate, where they migrate. And that once he sort of saw the genetic regulatory networks that are involved in Williams syndrome, which is a syndrome that basically makes you hypersocial, hyperprosocial, too much, and affects your facial morphology and some other things that we think may be involved with domestication, that these neural crest regulatory, it led him to be able to discover a neural crest regulatory gene that seems to be altered in modern humans and domesticated animals similarly. And this is the part where I really got lost in the paper. I'm like, whoa, I don't know. They used CRISPR and some other techniques to reveal, at least they argue, that this gene, BAZ1B, really does seem to have the impact on tissue. I think they did tissue cultures, and then they looked at the migration of neural crests, or I shouldn't say the migration. They looked at the behavior of the neural crest cells, and were able to infer that really this gene that seems so important for Williams syndrome and has been altered in domesticated animals and modern humans, but not archaics, seems to be related to morphological changes, at least, that are suspected in the face of Williams syndrome patients. So anyway, these are I'm just trying to say that unlike, often when you're talking about evolutionary hypotheses, functional hypotheses, where to go next? Is this really testable? And I mean, this is really exciting because I do think that there might be a future at looking deep at what's going on. All right, what about behavioral, expanded behavioral windows? The prediction would be that, like we saw in bonobos and the foxes and in dogs, that you would, like in the case of the foxes, we see earlier socialization that continues throughout their life. Dogs, the same thing. Bonobos, we see social sexual behavior and tolerance and sharing food throughout the life. Well, you'd expect the same kind of expanded windows of development in humans. Now, it's predicted that this would be the case in Neanderthals. Of course, I've already made the point that we haven't caught any babies yet. But we can make some inferences from, I think, the fossil record, and others have. But this would be the predicted pattern anyway. So I'll remind you that we did find that there's early emerging social cognition in young infant humans, while the social skills in a young 12 to 24-month-old infant who has this totally undeveloped brain, they're deceiving us, they're beginning to talk, they have amazing theory of mind, while they don't know to put their drink on a level surface. Okay, so it seems that social cognition really launches while everything else is stumbling along, sort of, either going slower or sort of the same speed that you might predict in other great ape species. So we sort of have this early emerging and explosive development of social cognition. But those are great apes. What about our closest relatives that are now extinct, other species of humans? Maybe they just all looked like this. There's some really interesting work looking at the key morphological trait that paleoanthropologists use to decide if you die if you're human. And they find your fossils. So, 100,000 years from now when they find us, I guess they'll use this trait too, and it is the degree to which your skull is globular. So if anybody ever says to you, "Oh, what a globular skull you have," you can say, "Thank you. Yours is too." But where I'm going is there's a new paper in Current Biology that actually shows that there's individual variability in globularity within living humans, and it is related to Neanderthal genes. So Neanderthals have intergressed with with our species, and it ends up that those who carry Neanderthal genes have less globular skulls. And they've been able, through MRI work, to sort of look at the phenotype and link that to genetic genes that are actually involved in neurogenesis. All right, but for my purposes, talking about early emerging social cognition, what really caught me was Jean-Jacques Hublin's work, where he was comparing infant Neanderthal skull growth to human skull growth. And what he argues with his collaborators is that the big difference and what leads to globularization is a change in the developmental pattern of the human skull. And the big change is in parietal development that likely, and this is where I'm being a little hand-wavy, but one might get excited that this is related to areas that are involved in early emerging social cognition, like TPJ or precuneus. So we know that the globular cranium, due to Jean-Jacques Hublin's work, is due to the maintenance of fetal growth levels throughout infancy. So 4 or 5 years of age, you're still, these regions are still expanding according to his work at fetal levels, whereas Neanderthals are looking more like other great apes, and they're finishing their development of these areas much, much earlier. And so that's what leads, at least, to the unique shape of the human head, and perhaps there's a link to the underlying neurobiology, that's causing the expansion in these areas. All right. The other fun fact about globularization is that there is work now showing that pregnant women taking SSRIs, their infants do tend to have more globular infants. Their skulls are more globular, and that was because in rodents being given extra serotonin were having sort of similar changes in the shape of their skull. And I'm sorry, I apologize. I showed you the video, and I've been talking about globalization, but I didn't say what it is. And the idea is that this is a less globular, or actually a Neanderthal skull. It's like football shaped and longer, and the human skull is deeper and shorter, and it makes it more spherical. So we have like this volleyball head, whereas Neanderthals have a more football-like head. And the shocking current biology paper is that there is individual variability in living humans, and it's related to the degree to which you carry Neanderthal genes. Okay. All right. Just to highlight work by people like B.J. King and others arguing that there's graded brain development in humans, especially when it comes to executive function. Prefrontal cortex development and synaptic pruning is not complete until you're in college. I don't know if I would have been happier to know that or not in college. But anyway, that is remarkably long, that your brain is not through developing, and so that you have your full self-control and executive function until you're in your 20s. That's post, first reproduction in most natural reproducing human populations. So the argument is not only do we have early emerging social cognition, but we have expanded windows of development, perhaps to allow for plasticity. And there are arguments that this pattern is not the pattern that you would predict Neanderthals to have. It's certainly not what you see in living primates. This is just cool work showing that cortical neuron progenitor cells in humans really are different because apparently they're lazy and slow. They take much longer to develop than chimpanzee cells. They take longer to develop their full size, but they end up being larger and more connected. And this is just data showing that chimp cells migrate much farther, whereas human cells, they just kind of sit around, I guess, and are busy slowly getting bigger. And they also, it's nice work showing that human cells fire faster. All right. So again, just more evidence that it's not just about developing social cognition fast, it's also about taking a really long time to develop other parts of the brain. So graded cognitive development. All right, so finally, let me wrap up with sort of the last piece of the puzzle. And that is the idea that there's universal mentalizing mechanism that's behind both kindness and cruelty. Because I've argued to you that our species is friendlier. I've given you some evidence to test different parts of this model. But, humans as the friendly species, come on, you've got to be kidding. Well, the thinking is this, is that we have unique types or at least derived features of our psychology that allow us to cooperate and communicate in ways that other species cannot. And there's a social network in the brain, a theory of mind network in the brain that people are aggressively trying to understand better and better. At least we have the beginnings of understanding. But that same derived feature that allows for cooperative communication can be used to deny mental states to others. And the idea is it's an accidental byproduct that we can dehumanize those that threaten your group. The thinking being, if you feel threatened by a group or other individuals, well, your social network, your theory of mind just dampens. And all the derived features that allow humans to outcompete the other species now either are less active or dampen or slow down or turn off. And so therefore, you're not interacting with another human using unique features of human cognition or derived features of human cognition. And the thinking is we are universally designed this way. So it's a crazy thought, but let me bring you to think about my friend the polar bear. So when is it more beautiful to see a polar bear than when polar bear mom is playing with baby, having fun interacting with cubs, nurturing, nursing, being friendly and kind, right? And when is the absolute last time you should go near a polar bear? Okay, and so all I'm suggesting is the exact same mechanism we see in so many different mammals exist in us except for replace like me with kin or cub. And just like mama polar bear, if we feel that like me is threatened, then we shut down our derived features that allow us to cooperate and communicate like other species cannot. And it allows us to be more cruel than any other species that's ever evolved. All right, so just quickly some evidence, since I've got just a few minutes left. So this is work by Neurotiley and others using the Ascent of Man, which is actually the Leakey Foundation's logo. I think they need a new logo. But they've been using, he and his colleagues have been using this as a measure of dehumanization. There are others I can share with you. But I hope that everybody in this room, if I were to ask you about people in these different groups, and I asked you, okay, if you were going to rate how human these different groups of people are, how human do you think you are? Just move how human you think they are. And I think everybody in this room would probably move the sliders down here and be like, yeah, they're 100% human. All these groups of humans are human. Duh. There's really nothing to answer here. Well, it's funny, but this is the finding. So the finding is that it doesn't matter where you look and who you ask, and it doesn't matter what socioeconomic status or what political stance you take or you're interested in, or race, and the only group that hasn't really been done with yet are non-weird populations, Mike Gervin. So, but every industrialized or developing country that's been looked at, you see this pattern. And the key thing is, when I say this pattern, it's not this pattern. It's just that everybody you ask is going to dehumanize some group. Some proportion of people in every group. So if you ask 100 people, some proportion, let's say 10%, dehumanizes or rates one group you give them as not fully human. And the groups aren't chosen randomly, obviously. All right. And what we know is that better than measures of liking and prejudice, dehumanizing predicts violence against others in responses, but also there have been behavioral measures. If you know the work of Philip Goff, he's done some great work on police officers as well, using measures of not this type of dehumanization, but simianization. And he finds police officers who are more willing to simianize others are also more likely to have records with more violent interactions with those that they were simianizing. All right, so the thinking is that all humans can recognize human minds, and we're built to do this very early and automatically, but we're also built to potentially dampen that and turn it off when we feel that our group is threatened. That can prevent empathy or compassion. It allows for cruelty and violence. And the idea actually is, and it's very nicely illustrated, there's a new paper on eLife by Karsten de Drew's work. I have his older work here. But that when you have, oxytocin being this hug hormone, and everybody knows the story and arguments about that, but then why are there so many weird results? Well, one of the weird results may be explained by this phenomenon, because what de Drew's group has been able to show is that when you give people oxytocin, yes, they are very nice and they coordinate better with their in-group, but they're much more willing to do horrible things to those they see as threatening their in-group's ability to be successful. Okay, so Neurotiley has also very nicely shown, and others and his colleagues have shown, that the number one threat that leads one group to dehumanize another is the perception that your group has been dehumanized. And which makes sense, because the other group doesn't see you as fully human, which means they may do cruel and horrible things to you. So if you perceive that you're dehumanized, it seems that regardless of what culture or what race or what group of people have been looked at, people reciprocally dehumanize whoever you tell them is dehumanizing their group. All right. So, and just one last piece of evidence against this being something specific to some group of people. This was Neurotiley and his collaborator looking at using this measure after the Boston bombing. And what he found was that while before the Boston bombing, when he asked similar questions about ISIS, the general US population would put ISIS members sort of around 80 or 90. After the Boston bombing, they put them down at whatever this thing is, which is exactly the same rating that alt-right and white supremacists were rating ISIS members as. Interestingly enough, and to sort of leave on a positive note, is when he went back 2 weeks later, that pattern was completely gone. And the general US population had rated ISIS members back up here at 80 to 90, where they had before the Boston bombing. So it seems that when you have an acute threat, people will dehumanize, but they will get over it. It may be that some of the people who have chronic feelings towards others, maybe they have a more long-term feeling of threat. All right, but what I would suggest is this argues against the idea of bad apples. That, oh, it's just the bad apples who dehumanize. What I'm arguing is we're all built to dehumanize. And the question is then, knowing that, how do we engineer society so that we can immunize ourselves against it? All right, so that sort of completes my tour through some of the predictions. I think there's support in different ways for each of them, but we are at the very, very, very beginning. And I'm excited to hear your ideas of how we might move forward, but just to note that the unique features of humans that I noted, I think that we can account for them through self-domestication, whereas I don't think currently adaptive explanations can. And I think that many of the ideas are testable in this model. I hope you have fun reading Richard's book and maybe one day reading ours. And thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
So the Mickey Mouse study was done by Steve Gould in an essay called The Evolution of Mickey Mouse. So he actually measured all the different Mickeys over the decades. And the effect was a paedomorphism of the overall body and head. So the head got larger in proportion to the body. The ears got larger. I think the nose got smaller, a little cute pug nose, smaller jaw, and so on. So one testable hypothesis for you might be, is it sclera alone, or is it a package, a suite of characteristics? So I played with this idea in my 2003 book, The Science of Good and Evil, of the self-domestication by paedomorphism from Richard's previous book in the 90s. I forget what the title of that was.
Oh, demonic males, sure.
Yeah, demonic males. That the selection for friendliness, like the selection for friendliness in silver foxes, led to their smaller jaws, smaller teeth, sort of paedomorphic bodies, something like that. Anyway, my question then is not related to that, is that did you not like the brain size research because of social political abuses of that research in the past?
You're talking about our finding that absolute brain size is related to executive function? No. But that has happened subsequently. Actually, the dog finding, I actually wrote my collaborators about the dog finding, and I was like, it just came out this year, and I said, oh my gosh, we got to make sure this doesn't get a lot of coverage. It actually went online, and within 30 minutes of going online, it was all over Twitter, and it was a certain group of people that were very excited about it. The brain size stuff, no, I wasn't. It had nothing to do with that. It was that I am a big fan of adaptive explanations, and I also think that there is domain specificity, and that different ecologies have shaped species to solve problems that they need to solve to survive and reproduce. And I thought that this was a pretty good first cut at that. And what we found, and we had 3 workshops where everybody said what I just said, and everybody was sort of tired of people arguing that brain size is a great proxy for intelligence, because when people outside of animal cognition are talking about animal intelligence, they always use brain size, and we're sort of like, ah. And so, our first finding in trying to move past this was to just, encourage people to continue doing it. So that's why we were, and I think it's a really overwhelming signal. I do not think that is the end of the story. We already have data from a smaller sample of species within primates where if you use measures of social complexity that we didn't use here, you do see relations to social problem-solving tasks, not executive function, self-control tasks. So I do think there's a lot of work to be done, and people collaborating together, we're going to find some exciting patterns. But it was just like amazing that our maiden voyage out, and we find this screaming pattern for what we were annoyed at people always talking about.
So I like your hypothesis, but I'm worried that I like it for the wrong reasons. It's a very reassuring picture of humans, by and large, right? And we're university people are, very much in a sort of regions of the planet and SES strata, which are highly cooperative. And we are biased to want to project that in a fundamental way.
Right.
And so I was wondering, just to sort of not invert everything about the hypothesis, but shift it slightly. So if you look at, when people discovered collective aggression among chimpanzees, that got a lot of attention because it was seen as parallel to what humans do. And in fact, if you look at the ethnographic record, in the archaeological record, it looks as if humans have chronic low-level warfare everywhere all the time.
Right.
Like chimpanzees so far that we have observed, and unlike bonobos, right?
Right.
So I was wondering if one might sort of slightly shift the argument to say that instead of the productivity of in-group strangers, a different way of describing that category would be that humans are really good at recruiting people into coalitions that act against other coalitions. And we project and impose group categorization everywhere. And that's maybe, in fact, that the selection pressure is superior intergroup competitive ability, where groups can become much larger because it's no longer just the familiar individuals, but we can recruit into these larger categories.
I agree with that statement 100%. I have no problem with that. I didn't explicitly say, but I have no qualms with the hypothesis that there were direct interactions between Neanderthals and humans. I think we know that now, and that they weren't always very nice. And I think we, in a competition with technology and ratcheting and group size and the ability to have larger groups, I'm just starting with Neanderthals first.
Right.
I'm not even thinking within species competition.
Okay.
I'm not suggesting in any form or manner that we were somehow delightfully kind to Neanderthals and welcomed them into our group. And no, I think they didn't have white sclera. And I think that we were absolutely terrified of them. We had this ability to have larger group sizes, better technology, and we wiped them out. Whether that was through direct warfare or whether it was competition, I don't know which. And then when you turn to our own species, the pattern just continues. And I think especially the work on recent human evolution, the last 5,000 years, we see from the genomics where you've got populations coming from Asia wiping out the original hunter-gatherers in Europe, and the replacement again and again, like in Great Britain. So no, you're making my point and just emphasizing it in a slightly different way. But I guess my thinking on all this is, again, it starts with experiments on animals, where if you want to increase cooperative communication, you must select for friendliness. And I can turn off chimpanzee cooperation in 1 second if I just change the distribution of the food.
Right.
And they understand how to use the whole thing. They understand the game, they understand the task. I know I need you, but because I don't have the tolerance, I can't do it. So that's my starting point, because you wouldn't be able to cooperate to then compete if you don't have an increase in your ability to have self-control and less emotional reactivity. And one thing I didn't link together actually is the self-control or the executive function and the emotional activity, because my response to the Tomasella challenge is, you're right. emotionality or changes in emotional reactivity are not enough. But you've got self-domestication occurring in a human who has massive amounts of self-control relative to other animals, and now you reduce the emotional activity. So I think we agree, basically.
Sure, I'm going to exercise self-control, but just one final, just to see what you say. So Richard Wrangham argued that, humans have inhibited within-group violence, but not between-group violence, so that
Yes.
we have higher rates
Yes.
of between-group.
We're so at home.
And so
yes.
I just, in your discussion, it was seeming to be more univalent with just the description that you have to dehumanize in order to attack. And do chimpanzees have to de-chimpanseize to attack other groups? Is that how you would think of it?
No, I think that chimpanzees become fearful and they become aggressive. But I think when you have humans that have the ability to have empathy and compassion and concern and caring for others, I think that the first thing you've got to do is you've got to get that out of your way. And I think maybe the best, I think it's worth just rolling the video because I think it's better I don't even answer the question. This is a World War I veteran answering your question, I think. Let's see, is the sound going to work or, oh, it's not going to work, is it? You can't hear it. Oh, you can read though. Oh, good.
Tossed his rifle away, and I ran my bayonet through his chest. He fell, put his hand on the place where I had hit him, and then I thrust again. Blood came out of his mouth, and he died. I felt physically ill. I nearly vomited. My knees were shaking, and I was quite frankly ashamed of myself. My comrades, I was a corporal there then, were absolutely undisturbed by what had happened. One of them boasted that he had killed a Paulie with the butt of his rifle. Another one had strangled a captain, French captain. The third one had hit somebody over the head with his spade. They were ordinary men like me. One of them was a tram conductor, another one a commercial traveler. Two were students, the rest were farm workers, ordinary people who never would have thought to do any harm to anyone. How did it come about that they were so cruel? I remembered then that we were told that the good soldier kills without thinking of his adversary as a human being. The very moment he sees in him a fellow man, he is not a good soldier.
Okay, so, that would be my hypothesis, that the way you get cruelty out of good people is you have them morally exclude other human beings by turning off the derived features of our theory of mind, seeing them not as fully human, and having others interact with, basically you're interacting with humans as if they were not human. Yes, ma'am. I'm not sure. Can you try one more time? Right. 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 So you were around people who are more homogeneous physically and language-wise, et cetera. Yeah, I mean, I think if what you're saying is that you have to. I mean, the thing is about human identity, it can be based on anything. I mean, if you remember, at least in my experience growing up as a human, if you had your backpack on both your shoulders at my middle school, I mean, you were going to get throttled. And you had to have it on one shoulder. And so you were identified as in-group or, part of, like me based on this totally arbitrary thing. So sure, yeah, you look like me, blah, 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 but we have this unbelievable ability to creatively decide that people who are identical to us are actually different. And so I think that's the mechanism, yeah.
I hate to stop a good back and forth, but I think we have to call it there. Let's thank Brian for such a
Thank
great,
you guys so much.
stimulating talk series.